Good morning and welcome to Space Drunk Podcast, the co-video edition. This is a really quick impromptu episode about the executive order that came out overnight on Australian time from the US, from Donald Trump. And the title of the executive order is Encouraging International Support for the Recovery and Use of Space Resources. Now, this may seem incredibly niche and not very interesting, but I can assure you that while it is very niche, it is extremely interesting. I will caveat that I'm not a space lawyer in a practicing sense. I study space law, which is a very different thing. I basically look at the treaties themselves and look at the way that we interact with them from an academic perspective. I'm not a practitioner of space law in the sense that I don't stand up in international courts and talk about it. Having said that, I was on this very day meant to be in Geneva at the UN there talking about space law. So I guess I'm a little more involved with it than your typical academic sort of arm's length study type person. At the same time, I am not a space lawyer. Excellent. So there are three kind of key things that came out of this executive order that I think you need to be across. The first one is that it reinforces the previous 2015 statements from the US government around US companies and citizens' rights to resources in space. In the laws that kind of came through like a few years ago said that you had the right to go and mine things and use resources. At the time, there was some lack of clarity, I suppose, about what that actually means. And in some ways, I think that this statement is designed to clean up any confusion and make it really clear that the US government really does mean that if you are a commercial entity and you go and you mine resources on an asteroid or on the moon or elsewhere in space, that you do get to do that in a commercial sense. So that's the first important thing that came through loud and clear from this. The second one is it very much, it's fairly rude to the Moon Agreement in the sense that it says very clearly the Moon Agreement can't sit with us. The Moon Agreement is, in fairness, not the most popular bit of space law. It was the last major treaty, and it has only got 18 states party, of whom they're keen to pull out the 17 number who are members of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. Australia is one of those 17 or 18 if we're taking the larger number there. And so as an Australian, we would view the Moon Agreement as binding international law as regards Australia and the other signatory countries. But for the US, they don't see it in that way, and they've really resisted efforts to get them to sign up to it. In this particular executive order, they make it really, really crystal clear that they also reject the idea that the Moon Agreement represents any kind of customary international law. And this is because discussion has been going on recently in the space law community about what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate when it comes to using space resources and going and mining them and using them either to get from the moon to Mars, as in the US's Artemis program plan, or selling those resources for profit. And one of the arguments that came up is that maybe the Moon Agreement could be seen as customary international law. Customary international law is law that doesn't appear in a treaty or that countries haven't necessarily signed up to in treaty form, but is viewed so widely as being law and binding behavior, and people kind of obey it anyway, that we come to see it as this kind of law through custom rather than law through words. And I think that in some ways saying the Moon Agreement is customary international law was maybe a little punchy to begin with. But in any case, the US has come back in this executive order with a strong right hook and a knockout punch saying, absolutely not, we don't see it as customary international law, which is fine. I do think, though, that the wording that they use and the extent to which they say that will be really interesting to watch what other countries say. There was some suggestion during some meetings that other countries may not see it that way. And so I would definitely be watching your international space news over the next couple of days to see what countries have to say. I'm curious to see what Australia says, but beyond Australia, I guess the opinion of China, Russia, India, and the UK will matter quite a lot. So that'll be very interesting. The third thing that is really interesting and very important is that it basically rejects, I'm going to find the exact wording, because I think it is quite important. Bear with me while I open this email. Right. So the relevant bit is maybe halfway down the executive order, and it says, Americans should have the right to engage in commercial exploration, recovery, and use of resources in outer space, consistent with applicable law. Outer space is a legally and physically unique domain of human activity, and the United States does not view it as a global commons. Accordingly, it shall be the policy of the United States to encourage international support for the public and private recovery and use of resources in outer space, consistent with applicable law. So I guess the key thing in this phrase is that the third key point really is that the US is rejecting that space is a global commons. And the key differentiating factor here is whether a global commons means an area that is governed in a cooperative sense, or whether a global commons means an area that everyone has access to. And the definition of what the US thinks global commons means will be absolutely instrumental in understanding what this actually means. But I think what they're basically saying is that they don't see this as an area that has to be treated specially. It's an area just like any other area, and the US is going to say, let's go in there and mine the hell out of it, I guess, if you want to, as a private company or a public company. This is kind of a big deal, and it's really the main point of this executive order that I think will cause a lot of discussion over coming days and weeks. But that's all. I think it'll be really fascinating to see what happens. It is a very interesting kind of executive order to come out at this time. I think maybe the reason it's come out at this time is because it had been intended to come out at this time after discussions happening at the UN COPUOS Legal Subcommittee, which was meant to have concluded on Friday. So that would have been running for the last 2 weeks. Due to COVID-19, it was postponed and didn't run. And in any case, I will be trying to hunt down some relevant people to talk about this with more expertise over the next week or two. But in the meantime, do go and read it, see if you can find it, engage on Twitter if you feel like you would like to. And the other thing is that I did record myself reading the whole Moon Agreement. So if you want to see, if you want to learn more about the wording of the agreement that was criticized by Donald Trump, then you should definitely watch that, and the link will come up after this video. That's all. I hope you have a lovely rest of your day. And I hope that if you are a Moon Agreement fan, as I am, that you are not too distressed by all of this. I'm sure that it will all come out in the wash, as they say.